On this episode of the podcast, we begin a series on hyperconverged infrastructure. We're going to start with a guest who's put a few products through the ringer to decide what HCI vendor worked best for them. Hello, and welcome to the Explore VM podcast. I'm your host, Paul Woodward Jr. Today we're going to take a look at hyperconverged infrastructure and what it actually looks like to decide to go that route versus traditional three-tiered architecture. My guest today has quite a bit of experience in doing this in their production environment. Alan, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you, Paul. I'm Alan Comstock. I've been working in IT since the early 90s, starting with a local PC repair business onto an internet service provider, and then 12 years as an administrator for sysadmin for a school district. I'm currently working for a 250-bed hospital in the Midwest, and it's been more of an enterprise role for me these last 8 years, and I'm focusing on VMware and storage.
All right, so you and I chatted a little bit offline. So you went through quite the large proof of concept, and you actually pitted three vendors against each other in the hyperconverged space. I guess my first question is going to be, why did you decide, or why did the company, I shouldn't say you, why did the company decide to go the hyperconverged route versus what I'm going to assume is the standard three-tier they were coming off of?
Yes, so we are a three-tier. We've been using EMC SANs and HP 3-par SANs for at least the last 8 years that I've been working there, even longer for the EMC. And we were seeing just the complexity that was happening between our two data centers. This past year, we spun up an active data center, and it's for the amount of FTEs that we have to administer that, we were needing something simpler, hopefully something that was less expensive. So that we got started on that. We had also already had purchased a demo unit of HCI infrastructure about 4 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, and had been very happy with it, been using it in a test environment.
So when you picked out the vendors, what were some of the prerequisites that you looked at, or even the project overall? What were some of the prerequisites going into making this move?
Mm-hmm. Like I said, we have two active data centers. We wanted that to have that metro availability and stretched cluster for the data stores between the two sites. Also was wanting all flash, which some vendors weren't too keen on that, but we had been undersized before on some of our SANs, and we wanted to make sure we didn't have that issue again, and the business was willing to pay for that cost. So that was one of the prerequisites, and also the ability to put all of our tier 0, 1, and 2 applications on it.
All right, so you've got your prerequisites, you got your environment that you're coming from. How did you get the ball rolling on this overall project? Did you bring in all the vendors at the same time? Were we looking at one at a time? What did the beginning stages of this look like?
The beginning stages were actually with our test cluster, and that was a Nutanix block that we had purchased 3 years ago. So we were familiar with HCI and what its advantages were. From there, we were looking, about 2016, just a colleague and I went to VMworld and was looking at HPE SimpliVity and also at VxRail. So those kind of came into the mix just from VMworld and seeing some of the demos there. And from there, we just had some demos. Vendors bring in some information about that along with salespeople and sales engineers to give us some information on it. We brought it down to 3 vendors, which was HPE SimpliVity, VxRail, and vSAN, and Nutanix.
So we could all sit here and listen to the marketing folks tell us how great their products are. What were the actual tests that you ran on these pieces of hardware to really see what they were worth?
Since we didn't have any on-site demos, something that we could actually unplug wires, drives, and see its failover settings, we were kind of at the mercy of what the salespeople were telling us. The one thing that we did go through all of them were hands-on labs type of demos, to where they would give us a sandbox and we could spend the day on it and test things out. So we did that with all the products and ended up making our choice shortly after those labs.
Now, there's a bunch of HCI vendors in the marketplace, and that number seems to be growing. I wouldn't say daily, but it's growing quite a bit. Why did you bring it down to those three vendors in particular versus the ecosystem out there?
Mm-hmm. Um, Manageability was probably the biggest one. Like I said earlier, we are kind of short on FTEs as far as some of this operational work that we do, and we wanted something that was easy to manage. And of those three, those were probably the easiest, the ones that you could get firmware updates from the factory, ready to apply with one click. Nutanix has its Prism and Prism Central capabilities to make upgrades simple. VxRail uses the VxRail Manager for its hardware lifecycle management, and SimpliVity also has OneView to help out with all that. So that was probably the reason why we nailed it down to those three.
Okay, so your basic day-to-day operations, maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. Okay. Looking at your criteria, now you've whittled it down to the three vendors. What were the pluses and minuses of these vendors? Because obviously no solution is perfect for every environment. Product A might have features B does not have, and B might have features you need that C doesn't have. So what were some of the main? You don't have to go into a ton of detail, but just what were some of the highs and lows of each solution?
Sure. I'll start with Nutanix. We had been a previous customer, so we're familiar with their support, and that's probably one of the biggest pluses that they have is when we call in, it's been a first call resolution. Probably the biggest negative that they have is the cost. But then again, it's also very difficult to compare a Nutanix cost with other vendors just because of the extra features that they have, such as like Calm and self-service portal, things like that.
Right.
But we were able to lower some of those costs. We had everything with the Ultimate license, which was given us, which all we really wanted out of that was the Metro replication. So they had just started allowing us to go with Pro with an advanced replication add-on, so that dropped the price significantly. The other minus on that, on the cost with Nutanix, is their flash, an all-flash array is quite expensive. They tout the fact that you don't need it. A hybrid is fine because it will actually tear down that slower data. But again, we were one of our prerequisites was having all flash. Again, for Nutanix, we talked about the management, simple upgrades, really looking into that to make that as easy as possible. Maybe I don't know if I want to say this as a negative, but it was for us on our first deployment of Nutanix. We had an older NX 1000 series that had a BIOS issue with that Supermicro hardware. Lasted about 2 months before the issue was resolved, but since then we hadn't had any other issues with it. But that's always something that was in the back of our mind. What if something like that happens again? We had actually, since we're an HPE shop for our blades and rack mount servers, we had thought about the possibility of running Nutanix on the ProLiant hardware, but the licensing was cost prohibitive for all support and ongoing costs after like 3 or 4 years. So that's kind of the plus and minuses for Nutanix. For HP SimpliVity, probably their biggest plus was the cost. It was much cheaper than any of the other vendors. Their hardware was a big plus. We also were very familiar with the DL380 line and know it's proven in the enterprise. A couple of things that didn't work so well was our demo and hands-on lab. Didn't have that storage feature, the Metro storage feature we were looking for, and a lot of tasks that just ended up failing when we were running the demos. Let's see, one of the others on the HPE was their OmniStack VMs. They take a lot of, they're pretty resource intensive, 128 gigs of RAM. They seem to max out the RAM, max out I shouldn't say max out the CPU. We never saw that, but then again, we weren't moving a lot of data between it. A plus side for SimpliVity was their backup solution and RapidDR, although RapidDR wasn't exactly what I expected, and I don't think we got a very good demo of that. That's kind of a neutral on me for the RapidDR. Didn't get a good look at that. Let's see, and one of the others on that was probably the limitation at the time. I don't know if they've fixed it since. Was a cluster size limit of 8 nodes per site. We knew we were going to be expanding past that fairly quickly, and that was going to be pretty much a deal breaker until it got resolved. Let's see, I think that's about it for the SimpliVity. And the VxRail and vSAN, cost was fine. There wasn't any issues with that as far as comparatively between the other two. I had a plus on the management with that VxRail manager. Easy to deploy hardware updates. Probably a negative that we had was support. Just the VMware support that we sometimes get could be a little better, or sometimes we have to escalate our tickets unnecessarily. And probably the biggest one was I wasn't very familiar with the hardware or vSAN. Since we're a HPE shop, I had very little experience with vSAN and zero experience with Dell hardware. So, and at the time, we didn't have a VMware rep for our organization that was kind of pushing any of this stuff on us. And I think that had quite a bit to do with maybe even to say they didn't get their fair shake of the deal. So another one was we to go along with that, we kind of began our search before vSAN 6.5 took off. And, I know it's got a pretty good following these days, but when we started our search a year ago, I don't think it was quite as robust or in use as it is today.
So it sounds like some of the decisions that were made were kind of based on a little bit on familiarity. The fact that you actually had the hands-on equipment for Nutanix, and then you've got your VMware experience, obviously in your standard data center. Do you think had these vendors provided actual physical hardware for a month or two inside of your data center for testing versus these hands-on labs and demos, it might have helped or even like made your decision more difficult?
Definitely. That was one of the bad things about HP SimpliVity. They didn't give out demos, or at least they didn't have any available at the time we were looking. We didn't ask for a VxRail demo maybe because nobody offered it. I don't know exactly how that came about that we didn't get one, but we would have loved to have had a VxRail demo, and I think it would have swayed our decision.
Okay. So, were you working directly with the vendors on this, or did you have a partner? You don't need to name like the VAR or the reseller, but was there an intermediary, or are you going right to Nutanix, HPE, and VMware?
For HPE and Nutanix, we were working straight with the vendor. We didn't have a VAR involved until it came time to quoting out items.
Okay. After you've assessed the pros and cons of each of these vendors and you've whittled down your list to the top 3 and you're leaning towards one versus the other, how did you present it to the higher ups, the ones that made the approvals for purchasing? Like, I would believe like a CIO was involved or even a CEO potentially. Like, what was that next step now that you've got, okay, this is kind of what we're looking at, this is what we lean towards?
Mm-hmm. Well, I work with a great group of other sysadmins, and we all did these demos. We've all been in meetings where we're trying to figure out what exactly we want. And the great thing was we were all in agreement on what we wanted. So there wasn't any arguing or back and forth on what we should purchase. So we presented it to our director and CIO that we were all in agreement that Nutanix was going to be the vendor of choice. From there on, they pretty much took it over, dusted off some of the older quotes that we had, and for the Nutanix, there was some newer equipment and got some better processors and a newer line on the G6s.
I find that, I don't know, encouraging. It makes me smile a little bit that your team came, presented, this is what we want, and the CIO was like, all right, let's roll. Like, did you, no pushback? They just said, okay, we get it. You did your due diligence, that we'll go with it.
Oh, there was some pushback on the cost. Um, we are a lucky organization that our CIO backs us when we make some technical decisions. I think having our Nutanix block in-house kind of helped with that decision. So we really haven't had any issues with that in the last couple of years. So making that decision, it was more along the lines of we need to get the cost to where we can afford it.
Yeah, I would imagine. Yeah, it almost seemed too good to be true that they're like, yep, okay, this is what we want. Okay, let me go write the check.
Oh, it was a nail biter until I finally got the email saying the PO was generated. So we were all a little nervous. All right, what's it going to be? Is it going to be Nutanix? Is it going to be VxRail, SimpliVity?
Right. Now, you mentioned that your team, everyone had their chances at these demos, the demonstrations, the hands-on labs, etc. My thought was, you were going through all of these prerequisites and these changes, is that is kind of a big environmental shift in day-to-day operations of what you're looking at. And so there's no one on the team who was opposed to it? You said like everyone was on board?
As far as going to HCI or the vendor we chose?
Like going to HCI and even like trying to adapt to. So with Nutanix, you've got Prism, and unfortunately, I don't really know HP SimpliVity, like the management layer that you mentioned earlier. So like under the new layer of stuff that you've got to pick up and learn. There was no real hesitation on the team. Everyone's on board.
No, we didn't have any issues with people changing this technology. I had been the primary over the SANs, so I'm thinking if anybody was going to get mad about it, it would be me. uh, so I think really it's engaged all of our admins to become more part of the VMware and storage infrastructure on this. I mean, we've been running this for 3 months now. We have Nate Bruns as our lead on the Nutanix as far as day-to-day operations. He's been migrating machines over, making sure the metro clustering's working, checking on any alerts that come up, and creating tickets. So I've actually been more hands-off on this than I may have on any other project that we've done, between the active data center, the syncing of the SANs, and things like that, mainly because it works. We're just sitting here after we've had it implemented. We had our VAR come in, set it up, and once it was set up, it was handed off, and we haven't had any issues since. Only issues we've had were backup issues and making snapshots on those metro clusters, which that's we found in a white paper that it can't be done. So at least not yet. So it's been pretty hands-off for most of us as far as day-to-day operations. We're just seeing it in vCenter. We're setting up affinity rules to keep our VMs where we want them between the two data centers, putting them on the correct data stores. Some of them are replicated. Some of them are just standalone at each site, and definitely no negative feedback from the other admins.
So you mentioned, your vCenter in there. I was actually going to ask, so you are running ESXi on top of the Nutanix cluster? You did not go with their hypervisor offering?
No, we haven't. As far as I know, it's still metro availability and the synchronous replication that's unavailable in AHV. Even with when it is, I don't know if we'll be moving our hypervisors to that. We're pretty happy with our ESXi flavor. I've been running it for years. They're already purchased. We do keep support on all of our licenses, but I don't know if we're quite ready to move over to that yet. I think a lot of that is driven by our vendor support. Cisco Call Manager for one. Some of our EMR applications. I don't know if they are AHV certified yet, so we'll just be waiting in the winds for that.
Right. And honestly, at this point, the Acropolis Hypervisor AHV is an interesting product. It's certainly growing, but VMware's been here forever, celebrating 20 years. Like, it's hard. In some cases, it's kind of hard to move away from that when you've got so much, like you said, vendor support. When you know how your applications run on that, you
Hmm.
know that this is a certified configuration or a supported configuration. So yeah, especially in a medical field, that could prove interesting. If in the
Hmm.
future, you change hypervisors, I would say to AHV or Hyper-V. Um, I'd be interested to have you back on and like just listen to that whole conversation about hypervisor changes in such a large environment. But that's
Hmm.
that's a topic for a different day. So you said, okay, we're 3 months into this project now. We're running all Flash. We're running on hyperconverged. Were there any issues that you were having on the three-tiered days that that you've noticed have gone away with this migration, or are you still kind of too new to like pick that out yet?
It might be too new, although I mean we haven't had any issues recently with our three tier approach. We've uh, all the kinks have been worked out with that, so we're knock on wood still running applications on that. You know, we've moved up our lower tiered applications onto our newer SANs, and we're still running our HP blades in a production environment. So it's not that any of that has gone away, and I don't know if it ever will. I mean, we're always going to have a need for that, and mainly with some of our Microsoft clustering that we have. Unfortunately, with the high availability that we need, um, they don't even want the servers to reboot, and reboot on
Right.
another host for HA. They want to be able to fail over to another node instantly, when it comes time for, patching or a hardware upgrade.
Right. And with this migration process as well, are you just doing storage vMotion from cluster to cluster, or are you using some other method?
Yes, just using a regular migration. Getting the low-hanging fruit right now. We do have a lot of, like I said, Microsoft clustering and RDMs we'll have to take care of, and that'll be something that will require downtimes and more of the changing of those drives out to the iSCSI LUNs from the Nutanix.
Called out as a negative, at least in your scenario, that HPE SimpliVity's maximum cluster node size was too small for you. Where are you starting this project? How many nodes, and where do you kind of foresee the number going?
Yeah, we on our tier 0, 1, and 2 applications, we have 27 hosts in one cluster, and those are being synchronous or being shared between the two data centers. Um, we knew we needed to cut that down and get some higher core counts, mainly to save on licensing for our enterprise EA and for VMware licenses. Uh, of those 27, most of them had 32 cores, so they were older G9 blades. These newer Nutanix boxes, just for the fact that they're newer, they have the 6152 processors, so they can get 88 cores per host. So a big difference, much smaller footprint, and a lot of saving on licensing. And that's not necessarily a Nutanix thing. It would have been the same whether or not it was SimpliVity or VxRail. But we
Right,
did want to
right.
get those numbers down to save on mainly our Microsoft costs.
Okay. So you're not really noticing any kind of outside of what the processors are providing, not really noticing any footprint reduction. It's just purely bigger individual units are allowing more capacity per node.
Hmm. Absolutely, it's probably something we should have been trying for earlier, just in buying some bigger and better hosts. But a lot of the hosts that we were buying were smart buys, and at the time we're like, oh, look, these things are so cheap. Let's just go ahead and get them. But Microsoft's really killing us on our enterprise licenses. So that was
Okay.
something we had to think about.
Right. With migration projects, one thing I've noticed that seems to fall by the wayside is how are people going to back things up on the new infrastructure, especially when you get to something so completely different that what you're currently using may not actually fit what you've got going on. So was this taken was let me see if that good. Was backup accounted for in this project, or are you what product are you using? What are you kind of looking at if you're not using one in particular right now?
Hmm. Yeah, it probably should have been taken into account a little more than we already had been. Um, Having that Nutanix block in the past, we had backed it up. We backed it up when it was running ESXi and when it was running AHV, when we were using it as a sandbox. Never an issue with it. We're running Commvault. But the hiccup we had is when we did the synchronous replication on the Metro clustering, Commvault, which not necessarily their fault, but it cannot take snaps, hardware snaps of those volumes on the Nutanix and back them up off a hardware snap rather than doing a virtual machine snap through vCenter, like a traditional snap. Still don't have that working. I'm hoping that Nutanix and Commvault can get that worked out. I know they're trying to get that fixed. We're currently using Commvault and we have a software agreement with them until 2019, but we'll be evaluating new products here in the next few months. Well, in the first quarter of 2019, trying to get a grip on what we have available and I know there's a lot out there: Rubrik, Cohesity, Veeam. I'm just wanting to know for any of my Nutanix admins or HCI admins in general, what are you guys using? I know there's a lot out there to choose from. What are some that are getting the job done and easy to use?
Looking back at the whole process, since you've got hardware up running, you made your choice, things are being migrated over. What were some of the lessons learned from start to finish? Something that maybe the team didn't think of when they were approaching this project, or something that, anything that you can take forward into future projects, or like any tips you would recommend to anybody about to enter this process themselves.
Mm-hmm. I would, since most of my team, they're pretty involved in the V community, I think I would rely more on some of the other administrators that I've met at the VMUGs and user cons to find out what they're using for their HCI solution. Get some real world experience and something that's not a sales pitch. I would also probably expand a little bit more on the vSAN ready nodes. We were looking at VxRail, but I know there's a lot out there, and HPE also has vSAN ready nodes, and that is something we didn't consider. And I wish we would have. I wish we would have checked on VxRail, done some hands-on demos with them, or got a live demo into the organization.
Well, Alan, I want to thank you for your time. Where can the listeners find you on the internet?
Thanks, Paul. You can find me on Twitter at Mr_Uptime. And I'm also on LinkedIn. Just search for Alan Comstock, AlanComstock.
Excellent. Once again, I want to thank you for your time.
All right. Thanks, Paul.
And thank you for listening. In the future, watch for episodes where I dive into several different HCI technologies, what makes them tick, what makes them similar, what makes them different, to continue the conversation on hyperconverged infrastructure. Or if you're an HCI vendor and would like to be a guest on the ExploreVM podcast, please contact me on Twitter at ExploreVM, email me, paul@explorevm.com, or facebook.com/ExploreVM. And as always, thank you for listening.